She went down to the basement of her house after her husband's death. She just wanted to check some old things. But under a concrete slab, she saw a grave and a name she knew. What lay beneath it turned her whole life upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Anna Miller had never realized, until the year after her husband's death, how loudly silence could live inside a house. The old two-story home on the edge of a quiet Pennsylvania town had always felt full when Richard was alive. Full of movement, of muttered calculations from the basement, of toolboxes scraping across concrete, of the faint vibration of whatever machine he was building humming through the floorboards. When he passed, the house did not simply grow quieter, it grew still. It became a place where time didn't flow forward so much as pool in corners, unmoving, collecting dust as surely as everything Richard had left behind. She tried to fill her days with small routines that felt familiar. She swept the kitchen each morning, even if the floor wasn't dirty. She watered the same patch of begonias in the backyard, though fall was already turning the leaves crisp at the edges. She drove to the small grocery store on Maple Street every Wednesday, because she'd always done it on Wednesdays. Habit had become a kind of scaffolding, holding her upright when grief made everything else feel uncertain. Yet even with the safety of routine, there were places in the house she avoided, places still shaped by Richard's presence, places she wasn't ready to face. The basement was the worst of them all. She had disliked it even when she was young and newly married, long before their daughter was born. It was narrow and dim, with low beams and stone walls that seemed older than the house above. There was always a trace of moisture in the air, a faint metallic smell of iron or oil that clung to the walls no matter how often Richard aired it out. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast more shadow than light. Richard had loved it, though. He called it his workshop, his laboratory, his thinking room, as if the rest of the house were too ordinary for ideas that he believed might change the world. She had never understood the machines he built down there. Odd prototypes of lifts, levers, pulleys, complicated contraptions that groaned when he tested them, but always seemed to mean something particularly important to him. She had trusted him enough not to ask questions, but trust had blind spots, and hers were wider than she ever knew. Since his death, Anna had only been in the basement twice, and both times she had entered the room with the same uneasy, reluctant step she had used as a young woman. Even then, she had felt something deeper than simple discomfort. She had felt unwelcome. Richard's tools still sat on the shelves exactly as he'd left them, coated in a thin layer of powdery dust. His notebooks, dozens of them, were stacked on the old wooden workbench. His gloves lay neatly folded beside the vise he used for metalwork. His handwriting still marked the whiteboard, bolted to the wall, a cluster of formulas frozen in mid-thought. It was as though he had stepped out for a moment and never returned. She preferred to leave it all untouched. The upstairs, at least, felt like hers. She moved between rooms slowly, thoughtfully, as though walking through memories rather than spaces. Each object carried the weight of an entire chapter of her life. The faded quilt their daughter, Sarah, used to hide under during thunderstorms. The oak table Richard repaired for her on their 15th anniversary. The black and white photograph of Sarah smiling at age 9, wearing a bicycle helmet too big for her head, grinning at something beyond the frame. The photograph had always been one of Anna's favorites. It was taken only 2 years before the accident that had changed everything. Even after so many years, the memory of that day had not softened. It came back in flashes. Sirens wailing down the street, the neighbor pounding on the door, Richard's voice hoarse and shaking as he shouted her name. She had found him outside his workshop, pale as chalk, his hands trembling so violently that she had to hold one of them to keep him from collapsing. The paramedics arrived too quickly for her to understand what was happening, and when they carried Sarah's still, covered body out of the basement, Anna had screamed, until she could scarcely breathe. Richard had held her, whispering through tears that he was sorry, that he hadn't meant for any of it to happen, that she shouldn't see Sarah. Not like this. Not with the injuries she had sustained. He told her he would take care of everything. He told her to trust him. And she had. She had been drowning in grief, barely able to walk from room to room, and Richard had handled the arrangements quietly, telling her only that the funeral had been small and private, just as Sarah would have wanted. Anna had accepted every word blindly, because the pain was too great to question anything. Eventually, she stopped asking questions altogether. It was easier to believe what she had been told than confront the possibility that something was wrong. Nearly 3 decades later, the ache still returned, like a bruise that had never fully healed. Losing Richard had brought those memories back sharper, as if losing both of them, but her husband and the only person who remembered their daughter as she had been, had reopened a wound she had spent years trying to close. On a cold October morning, the water pressure in the upstairs bathroom weakened to a whispering trickle, forcing her to face the one place she least wanted to go. The plumber she called told her that if the problem was what he suspected, a blockage in a lower pipeline, he would need access to the auxiliary shutoff valve in the basement. He could come in 3 days. Anna had thanked him politely and hung up, feeling her chest tighten. She didn't want a stranger wandering through Richard's workshop. The idea made her strangely protective, though she didn't quite understand why. She told herself she would simply check the basement first. Perhaps it was something small she could fix herself. She waited until the afternoon sun had moved across the living room wall before gathering her courage. She slipped on her thick house shoes, grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and made her way to the door that led downstairs. The wooden frame creaked softly, as if the house itself hesitated to let her pass. When she opened the door, the cool, stale air from below drifted upward, brushing against her skin like a memory she didn't want to feel. She paused on the top step, gripping the handrail. For a moment, she almost turned back. But the thought of the plumber poking through Richard's things pushed her forward. This was her house, her husband's space, her daughter's past. She would handle it. Each step creaked under her weight, her flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the dim half-light. Shadows stretched from the workbench to the far wall, and the smell of old oil and dust grew stronger as she reached the bottom. She tried to move quickly, more out of discomfort than fear, and made her way toward the utility box near the back wall. That was when she noticed it. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. The concrete floor was patchy in places, uneven in color, but one particular section, near Richard's workbench, looked different. She had never paid close attention before, but now she realized the shape was too precise to be accidental. It was a rectangular slab, slightly lighter than the surrounding concrete, with faint tool marks along the edges, as if it had been poured later, at a different time than the original floor. She shone her flashlight directly on it. Something about it unsettled her deeply, something she couldn't immediately name. She knelt carefully, her joints protesting, and tapped the surface with the handle of her flashlight. A hollow echo answered her. The sound was so unexpected that she nearly dropped the light. Hollow, under a cement floor that should have been solid. She tapped again, this time with trembling fingers, and heard the same unmistakable emptiness beneath. Her pulse quickened. A coldness spread through her chest, though the air around her was already chilly. She didn't believe in intuition or omens, but she felt something unmistakable then. A quiet, terrible certainty that something was wrong. Something hidden. Her breath unsteady, she looked around until she spotted Richard's old pry bar leaning against the wall. It took both hands to lift it, the metal colder than she expected. She returned to the slab and wedged the bar into the faint gap between the concrete and the surrounding floor. It resisted at first, refusing to budge, as though the house itself objected to her interference. But Anna pressed harder, teeth clenched, feet braced against the floor. The slab lifted a fraction. She repositioned the bar, lifted again, straining her back until it ached. Slowly, inch by stubborn inch, the slab rose enough for her to push it aside. The heavy scrape of concrete against concrete echoed through the basement like a warning. Beneath the slab lay compacted, earth-dark, uneven, freshly disturbed compared to the dryness around it. Anna knelt again, drawn forward by a force she couldn't describe, and brushed the soil aside with her fingers. Dirt lodged under her nails. Her breathing grew shallow. Then her hand struck something hard. She leaned closer, brushing more soil away. A surface emerged beneath the dirt, smooth, cold stone. Her flashlight beam caught the faintest outline of engraved letters, barely visible beneath the thin layer of soil. She wiped the stone clean with the sleeve of her sweater. Her world stopped. The name carved into the stone was one she had spoken hundreds of times in grief, whispered in prayers, cried into her pillow. Sarah Miller. For a moment, Anna didn't understand what she was seeing. Her mind refused to connect the letters to reality. But the engraving was unmistakable, the dates beneath the name matching exactly the short span of years her daughter had lived. The stone was old, handmade, the surface uneven but carefully carved. Someone had placed it here intentionally, lovingly, sorrowfully. Someone she trusted. Her breath hitched, her lungs refusing to draw air. She stared at the stone, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. Memories crashed over her. Sarah laughing at the dinner table. Sarah asking endless questions about Richard's tools. Sarah hugging her tight the night before the accident. Those memories mixed with the image before her, impossible to reconcile. Her daughter had not been buried where Richard said she had been. She had been buried here, in the basement, under their home, under Anna's feet for nearly 3 decades. The flashlight slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows on the walls. Anna sank to her knees, her palms pressed into the cold earth, as though the room itself were collapsing around her. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, broken sound she hadn't made since the day Sarah died. She stared at the grave, at the stone marking the place where her child had lain concealed for half a lifetime, and felt the ground under her sway. The only words she could form trembled out of her in a whisper she barely recognized as her own. "Richard, what did you do?" For a long time after the whisper left her lips, Anna couldn't move. The basement felt smaller than it had moments earlier, the air heavier, as if the discovery itself had changed the very weight of the world around her. She crouched in the dirt, her hands trembling uncontrollably, her breath uneven and shallow. She could not tear her eyes away from the gravestone, from the too familiar name engraved in cold stone. The floor beneath her seemed to pulse with the unbearable truth that she had lived above her daughter's hidden resting place for 26 years without the faintest idea. She forced herself to look around, searching for something. Logic, reason, explanation. But the basement offered no comfort. Only shadows. Only silence. Only remnants of Richard's secrets. When she tried to stand, her legs nearly buckled. She clutched the edge of the workbench for support, inhaling sharply as she steadied herself. Every part of her mind rebelled against what she had seen, insisting she must be mistaken, that she must be confused, that grief and shock were making her see patterns where none existed. But the stone remained exactly where it was, carved with her daughter's name, clear and undeniable. She backed away slowly, unable to stay in the room a second longer. She made it to the stairs and climbed them with a stiffness that came not from age, but from fear. When she reached the kitchen, She closed the basement door with a shaking hand, as though she could lock away the nightmare waiting beneath her feet. She pressed her forehead to the wooden surface and held herself there for several breaths, willing her heart to slow. It refused. Her first instinct was to call her neighbor, but what would she say? She couldn't imagine speaking the words aloud, couldn't imagine telling anyone that she had found her daughter's grave under her own house. Even thinking the sentence felt impossible. But she needed help. She knew that. She grabbed her phone from the counter, her fingers clumsy and cold, and stared at the screen. She had to call someone official, someone who could confirm or deny, someone who could touch the thing she couldn't bring herself to face again. Her thumb hovered over the numbers, shaking so violently she had to grip the phone with both hands. She dialed 911. Her voice barely worked when the dispatcher answered. It came out thin, breathless, uneven. There's something in my basement, she managed. You need to send someone. Please. The dispatcher asked questions. Standard, calm, professional, but the words blurred in Anna's ears. She answered as best she could, repeating the only phrase that felt real. It's a grave. I found a grave. The dispatcher's tone shifted. The conversation grew slower, more deliberate. Help was on the way. By the time the police car rolled into her driveway, Anna was standing on the porch, arms wrapped around her body despite the mild weather. Her eyes were swollen, but dry now. She felt emptied out, like sorrow had hollowed her, leaving only exhaustion behind. 2 officers approached her, young men who tried to mask their concern with professionalism. She pointed them toward the basement and followed them only as far as the doorway. She could not bring herself to go down again. From upstairs, she heard the officers' footsteps, then a stunned silence. Nothing in their training could have prepared them for such a discovery. When they climbed back up, their faces were pale. Their expressions altered in a way she recognized instantly. They had seen something they wished they hadn't. One officer gently asked her to wait outside while they radioed for backup. She complied, because she could do nothing else. She stepped into the yard and stood beneath the large maple tree Richard had planted decades ago. Its branches swayed lightly, as if whispering things she didn't want to hear. She felt strangely detached from her surroundings, as though she were watching herself from somewhere far away. The world had tilted, her life had cracked open, and she could never return to the person she was only an hour before. Within half an hour, 2 additional police vehicles and a forensic van arrived. The quiet street, usually empty save for an occasional jogger or dog walker, suddenly looked crowded, filled with uniforms and equipment cases and cautious movements. Neighbors peeked from windows, drawn by the flashing lights, but no one ventured close. The officers kept the curious at bay, setting up yellow markers across the lawn and the walkway, surrounding Anna's home with a sense of official gravity. The basement was soon designated a crime scene, though no one dared to say the words aloud around her. The forensic team descended into the darkness, wearing gloves, masks, and professional caution. She stood by the door, clutching a cup of untouched tea someone had handed her. The steam had long faded, leaving the liquid cold and uninviting, yet she held the cup anyway, as though its weight anchored her. One of the forensic technicians gently approached her and asked her to recount everything she had seen. She tried, though her voice wavered and stopped often. The technician listened with the patience of someone who had heard many stories like this. Stories of shock, betrayal, grief, but Anna knew there was something different about hers. Something more tragic. Something more personal. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows in the yard lengthened. Finally, one of the lead investigators approached her. His face was somber, his manner careful, and she braced herself before he even spoke. "Mrs. Miller," he said softly, "we need you to step inside for a moment. There's something we want to show you." She followed them slowly down the stairs, her heart pounding again as it had earlier. This time, The basement was lit brightly by several portable lamps. The harsh white light revealed far more than her single flashlight ever could. The soil around the stone had been carefully brushed away, the grave partially exposed, but what drew her eye was the second rectangular shape beside it, another slab, slightly larger and thicker, which she hadn't noticed before. It too had been uncovered. The investigator gestured toward it. "This was buried next to the grave," he explained. "We opened it." He stepped aside so she could see the contents laid out on a sheet of clean plastic. There were papers, yellowed, fragile, some of them torn at the edges, as though they had been stored with little care. Schematics covered with neat handwriting, detailed sketches of metal frames, pulleys, and mechanical parts she didn't recognize. Equations and notes written in her husband's unmistakable script. And pieces of machinery, rusted, bent, some broken clean through, resting like remnants of a failed invention. Her throat tightened painfully. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Richard had made these sketches. Richard had written these notes. Richard had buried them. The investigator watched her carefully. "Do you know what any of this is?" She shook her head slowly. "My husband. He was always building things. Experimental machines. He said they were nothing important. Do you remember if he was working on anything around the time of your daughter's accident?" Anna swallowed hard. The memories flickered before her eyes. Richard running calculations late into the night. The heavy clank of metal from the basement on evenings when she was already in bed. Sarah sitting near him with fascination as he showed her how gears locked together. She nodded weakly. He had. Some kind of project. A large one. I never understood it. The investigator exchanged a subtle glance with one of his colleagues. Anna noticed, even through her shock. They were forming theories already, theories she couldn't yet bear to consider. She stepped back as the team continued its work. She watched as they took careful photographs, bagged pieces of metal, lifted the gravestone with solemn precision, and gently removed what lay beneath. She turned away before she could see too much. She wasn't ready. Not yet. When the medical examiner approached her later that afternoon, his expression confirmed what her heart already knew. "We can't say anything definitive until the lab completes its analysis," he said softly. "But, based on what we've found, the remains are consistent with a young woman of your daughter's age at the time she died." She closed her eyes. The world around her faded to a blur. It took nearly an hour before she found the strength to go back inside the house. The officers had finished their work for the day and removed the yellow tape from the doorway. They promised to return with more detailed findings, but for the moment, the house was quiet again. Except now, it felt contaminated by truths she had never asked to uncover. She made her way to the living room and sat heavily on the sofa. Her mind spun, but one thought repeated itself with relentless clarity. Richard had lied. He had lied about the funeral, about the burial, about those missing days she had spent in numb grief. He had lied about what happened to Sarah after the accident. He had lied so convincingly, so tenderly, acting as though he were protecting her. Maybe he believed he was. But she realized now that, while she had been drowning in sorrow, he had been drowning in guilt. The hours passed in unbearable stillness. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She simply sat in the dimming light of the living room, listening to the clock tick as it had every day since Richard died. Steady, unchanging, unaware that the world around it had come undone. Near sunset, a knock sounded at the front door. She already knew who it would be. She stood slowly, smoothing her sweater with unsteady hands, and opened the door to find the lead investigator standing there again, hat in hand, face heavy with compassion. "Mrs. Miller," he said softly, "I'm very sorry to tell you this. The preliminary DNA comparison we ran, It's a match. The remains are your daughter's." Anna didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, the wind brushing past her, as though the world continued its ordinary rhythm, while hers had stopped entirely. The investigator's voice grew dim as he spoke, assuring her they would continue looking into the circumstances, that they would gather every detail, that she wasn't alone. But she felt alone. She felt as though she had always been alone, and just hadn't known it until now. When she closed the door, she rested her forehead against it, just as she had earlier against the basement door. Long after the investigator had gone, long after the street had grown quiet, she remained there in silence, trying to breathe, trying to process the enormity of what she had learned. Eventually, she stepped away and looked toward the basement door in the hallway. The truth was no longer hidden beneath concrete. It had risen, like a ghost she didn't believe in, demanding to be seen, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be understood. And she knew that this was only the beginning. Night settled over the Miller house with an oppressive heaviness, as though darkness itself had weight and intention. After the investigators left, Anna tried to sleep, but her mind refused to quiet. She moved from the armchair to the couch, from the couch to the dining table, and from the dining table back to the living room, her thoughts looping endlessly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gravestone again, its rough edges, the uneven letters, the soil clinging stubbornly to its surface. She saw the second stone, too, the one that had concealed Richard's notes and the broken remnants of a machine she had never fully understood. And she saw, most painfully of all, the covered bundle the medical examiner had carried from the basement, light enough to be lifted by one man, yet heavy enough to crush whatever illusions she had left about her husband. She slept only in short, shallow bursts, where time felt warped and fragmented. Memories she had long buried rose with startling clarity. The sound of Sarah's laughter, the metallic rattle of tools from the basement, the way Richard used to hum under his breath when he was deep in thought. Sometimes the memories blurred together until she found herself standing at the top of the basement stairs again, as if drawn there by an invisible pull. But she never opened the door. She couldn't. Not yet. In the morning, she awoke with a dull ache behind her eyes, but there was no time to wallow. Her phone rang just after sunrise. The caller ID showed the county's forensic office. For a moment, she considered letting the call go to voicemail, but she forced herself to answer. The calm, practiced voice on the other end explained that while the official report would take longer, the preliminary tests confirmed everything the investigator had told her. The remains were without question those of a young woman whose DNA matched Anna's. There were fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, as well as indications of a high-impact mechanical accident. It was too early to determine the exact cause of death, but the examiner promised they were working diligently. She thanked him with a politeness she didn't feel, then ended the call and sank into a chair. It wasn't new information, not really, yet hearing it framed in clinical terms sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. She clutched the edges of the table to steady herself. 26 years of believing her daughter had been given a proper burial had been erased in an instant. Everything she had pictured, the cemetery, the headstone she'd never seen, the peace she thought Sarah had been given, had been a lie. Her husband's lie. The silence of the house pressed in on her. She needed to move. She needed to understand. With a heaviness she didn't try to hide, she made her way to the spare room on the second floor, where the investigators had placed a sealed cardboard box before leaving. It was filled with the items recovered from the second stone: Richard's notebooks, drawings, and technical documents. She had refused to look at them last night. She wasn't ready. But now she knew she had no choice. If she didn't search for answers, the questions would swallow her whole. She carried the box into the living room, placed it gently on the coffee table and sat down before it. For several long minutes, she stared at it without moving, remembering the countless evenings she had seen Richard working on similar notebooks. He always said his inventions were for one day, for a time when he could test them properly or present them to someone who could help him build them safely. She had believed him, though she never truly grasped what he was trying to create. Finally, she opened the box. The notebooks were familiar in their appearance, worn, their covers stained with grease and fingerprints, their edges frayed. She lifted the first one carefully, as though it might crumble if she held it too tightly. When she opened it, the pages crackled faintly. Her husband's handwriting, distinct and precise, filled every line. At first, the contents were purely technical, sketches of mechanical arms, hydraulic systems labeled with numbers, diagrams of pulleys, and levers annotated in fine detail. She recognized none of it, but as she flipped further, the entries became less formal and more personal, slipping from diagrams into thoughts. There were notes where he corrected his own mistakes, scolding himself in the margins for oversights. There were calculations circled and crossed out repeatedly, evidence of long nights and frustrated revisions. The deeper she read, the more she found pieces of a man she had never fully known. Richard had always been private with his work, but she had convinced herself it was because he wanted to surprise her someday with something grand. Now she realized it was because he feared she would see, long before this moment, where his obsession had led. She opened another notebook, this one dated around the year Sarah died. The writing was different, shakier, hurried, the lines etched into the paper with far more pressure than usual. The first entries were still technical, but the tone shifted abruptly several pages in. Then she found it. A dated entry written on the night of the accident. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, the ink smudged in places as if written through tears or trembling. She began to read. He had described the night in painful detail. He had been adjusting the main support beam of his prototype, a machine intended to lift heavy materials with minimal human effort. He believed it could revolutionize construction, reduce injuries, and save lives. He had been so close to a breakthrough, convinced that with one more test, one more adjustment, the machine would work perfectly. Sarah had come downstairs to bring him tea. She had always been curious, always eager to help. Richard wrote that he had told her to stand back, that she had promised to stay behind the marked line. But he became absorbed in his work. He didn't notice when she stepped closer. He didn't hear her call his name over the noise of the machine. He heard only the crack. A steel component had failed, launching the frame forward with catastrophic force. Richard turned just in time to see the structure collapse toward his daughter. The entry became disjointed, then sentences cut short, words repeated. He wrote of how he tried to reach her, how he tried to pull the machine away, how he screamed for help that came too late. He wrote of holding her, of realizing she was already gone, of the unbearable silence that followed. Anna pressed a hand to her mouth, her tears falling freely now. She forced herself to keep reading. The later entries were worse. Richard wrote that he panicked. He feared the consequences, feared that the police would arrest him for negligence, feared that his invention, his life's work, would be blamed entirely for her death. But above all, he feared Anna's reaction. He didn't believe she could survive seeing Sarah's body. He didn't believe she could endure the truth. So he made decisions no person should ever make. He buried their daughter in the basement because he couldn't bring himself to place her in the ground alone. He couldn't bear the idea of her being somewhere he couldn't watch over her. He buried his machine beside her, along with every idea he had ever had for improving it, telling himself it was punishment, that his brilliance deserved to be buried with the life it took. Anna closed the notebook abruptly, her breath ragged. She couldn't read another word. She set the book down with trembling hands and leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling as though it could offer her peace. But there was none. Only grief. Only betrayal. Only the awful knowledge that the man she had loved for more than 40 years had kept a secret so large, so crushing, it had shattered her almost beyond repair. She spent hours in that position, fighting an internal war. She wanted to hate him, but she could still remember the gentle way he held her hand when she was sick, the pride in his eyes when Sarah took her first steps, the unwavering devotion he showed her in countless small ways. He had loved them both deeply. That much she had never questioned. But love had not prevented him from committing an unforgivable act. Love had not saved their daughter. Love had not protected Anna from a lifetime of lies. By the afternoon, an officer arrived again to provide a formal update on the investigation. He took a seat across from her, his expression respectful but tired. She listened numbly as he explained that they were treating the matter as a historical case now, though the legal implications were complicated given how much time had passed and the fact that the primary suspect, her husband, was deceased. They had found no evidence yet of any accomplice, though they were investigating a former colleague of Richard's based on some letters they'd uncovered. They asked her questions. Did she recall any unusual visitors around the time of the accident? Did Richard ever mention working with someone on the machine? Did she ever see anyone helping him transport heavy materials into the basement? She tried to answer honestly, though her memories of that time were warped by grief. She recalled a man named Frederick Campbell, another engineer with whom Richard shared technical conversations, but she didn't know whether he had been involved. She remembered loud noises in the basement even after the funeral, noises she had assumed were Richard cleaning. Now she wondered if those noises had been him burying both Sarah and the remnants of his invention. The officer took notes and promised to let her know if anything else surfaced. When he left, Anna found herself alone again, surrounded by silence and memories and the now open box of notebooks that had become a doorway into a past she never wanted to revisit. But she couldn't avoid it anymore. She reached for the next notebook and forced herself to continue reading. The entries became increasingly introspective in the weeks following the accident. Richard wrote about his guilt consuming him from the inside, about the nightmares that kept him awake, about how he feared his mind would break if he spoke the truth. He wrote about Anna's grief, how fragile she had been, how lost, how he couldn't bring himself to add more pain to her already shattered heart. Later entries revealed that he had planned to confess many times. He wrote letters addressed to Anna, each one an attempt to tell her what he had done. But he never delivered any of them. They remained hidden, like everything else. He had hoped that burying the invention would end the part of him that had caused the tragedy. He swore never to touch engineering again, and he kept that promise. After Sarah's death, he never built another machine. His workbench gathered dust. The tools he once used daily became untouched relics. He spent the rest of his life in quiet routines, taking care of Anna with a soft, almost desperate tenderness, as if trying to repay a debt that could never be settled. Anna felt a strange mixture of sorrow and anger. She understood his fear, understood his guilt, but understanding did nothing to lessen the betrayal. He had left her alone in her grief without the truth. He had mourned silently, while she carried an emptiness she assumed came from not being allowed to see her daughter's body. She had accepted that missing part of closure as part of life. Now she realized it had never been necessary. It had been engineered to hide his shame. Hours passed as she read. When she finally set the last notebook down, the sun had already begun to set. The room was dim, the shadows long. She felt hollowed out, exhausted, spent. She stood and walked to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. but even that simple task felt monumental. When she brought the glass to her lips, her hands shook so much that water spilled onto the counter. She turned and faced the hallway leading to the basement. The door at the end of it looked no different than it ever had, yet it seemed now like a border between two worlds she didn't wish to navigate. Behind that door lay the truth, exposed, cold, unchangeable. Ahead of her lay the future, equally uncertain. But one truth surfaced clearly as she stood there, gripping the counter with trembling fingers. She couldn't stay paralyzed. She needed to take the next step, not because she was ready, but because she had no choice. Tomorrow, she would have to bury her daughter properly. Tomorrow, she would have to face Richard again, not as the husband who had loved her, but as the man who had deceived her. Tomorrow, she would decide what to do with the house that had become a mausoleum of lies. But tonight, all she could do was sit in the quiet and try, with great difficulty, to breathe. When she returned to the living room and lowered herself into the armchair, she knew, without question, that her life had split cleanly into two halves. The years she believed one story, and the years that would follow now that she knew the truth. And nothing, not her memories, not her grief, not even her love for her husband, would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, the Miller house seemed to stretch and shrink at the same time, too large for one woman to inhabit alone, too small to hold the enormity of the truth she now carried. Anna moved through its rooms, as if stepping through layers of her own memory, each space echoing with the life she once believed she understood. She lived quietly, mechanically, but no part of her felt steady. It was as though every breath reminded her of the truth she had unearthed. Every sound in the empty house reminded her of all the years she had lived with a secret she never asked to share. The investigators returned several times, always polite, always solemn, as though careful not to place further weight on her already fractured heart. They brought her updates, though little changed. They confirmed the mechanical components were from a prototype engineered by her husband. They confirmed the remains were now securely in the custody of the county coroner. They confirmed that the letters Richard had written were being analyzed for context and timeline. None of it surprised her. She felt as though she had already lived all these revelations once, painfully, through the pages of his notebooks. It was the final visit from the medical examiner that shifted the world again, not with new information, but with confirmation. He sat beside her at the dining table, a gentle man with tired eyes, and walked her through the final report. The injuries were consistent with a sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure. Death had likely been immediate. There had been no signs of prolonged suffering. He spoke softly when he told her this, as though offering a small mercy he wished were larger. She nodded, thanked him, and folded her hands together to keep them from trembling. When he left, she found herself staring at the framed photograph on the wall, the one of Sarah at 9, wearing a helmet too large for her head and laughing in the bright summer sun. The child in the photograph had no idea what life would take from her only 2 years later. And Anna, looking at her now, felt a grief so deep that she wondered how her chest could contain it. She spent that entire night awake, pacing the floor, thinking of what she needed to do next. The decision had been forming slowly since the moment she learned the truth. She owed her daughter the burial she had been denied. She owed her a ceremony that acknowledged her existence, her life, her innocence. She owed her a resting place worthy of the love she had given so freely. By dawn, the decision was final. She contacted a funeral home in town, a place she had not visited since her own mother died, and explained, in careful, halting words, what she needed. The director, a patient woman with gray hair pulled back in a tidy bun, spoke gently and assured Anna they would handle everything. They would help her plan the service, arrange the burial, coordinate with the church if she wished. They would make sure Sarah was laid to rest with dignity. Anna thanked her repeatedly, feeling tears rise from a place inside her she had not touched in decades. The funeral was scheduled for the end of the week. Word had spread quickly through the small town, though Anna didn't know how. When she arrived at the chapel on the day of the service, she found more people there than she expected. Neighbors who remembered Sarah's laughter echoing in the yard, a few of her childhood teachers now older and slower, a couple of women who had once been part of the PTA with her. Even the lead investigator stood quietly in the back, hat removed, his presence a respectful acknowledgement of the painful journey she had taken. The urn sat at the front of the chapel, atop a small table draped in white cloth. A bouquet of lilies rested beside it, Sarah's favorite flower, though she doubted anyone but her and Richard would have known that. The sight of the urn made her breath catch. It was the first time she had seen anything that represented her daughter's physical remains. For 26 years, she had believed Sarah lay beneath a headstone she had never visited, in a cemetery she never truly questioned. Yet here she was in the chapel, finally able to say goodbye. When it came time to speak, she stood slowly, holding the back of the pew for balance. She stepped forward, turned to face the gathered group, and felt her voice tremble before she even spoke. She didn't prepare a speech. She couldn't have. Instead, she let the words come from the place in her heart where grief and love intertwined. Sarah was the joy of our lives, she began softly, her voice echoing faintly in the chapel. She had a kindness about her that made every room feel warmer. She was curious, bright, always asking questions, always eager to help her father, in ways I thought were too complicated for a child to understand. She loved us deeply, and we loved her more than I can put into words. Her voice cracked, and she paused. Her life ended too soon, she continued, far sooner than I ever imagined possible. And the truth of how she left this world has been difficult to face. But she deserved better. She deserved honesty. She deserved peace. And today, after all these years, she will finally have it. She returned to her seat, with a heart so heavy it felt anchored to the floor. Yet somewhere beneath the weight was a small flicker of something like relief and happiness. Not closure, but the first step toward accepting what she could not change. After the service, the procession made its way to the cemetery. The autumn air was crisp, and the sky held a pale grayness that seemed fitting. The burial plot was near the back, under the shade of an old oak tree, whose branches moved gently in the wind. The pastor spoke short, comforting words. People placed flowers beside the urn. Anna knelt briefly, touching the smooth surface of the wooden box, whispering a private goodbye before standing again. When the ceremony ended, the others drifted away, offering condolences as they passed. Soon she was alone beneath the oak tree, listening to the rustle of leaves overhead. She stayed there a long time, feeling the weight of all she had lost, and the weight she had finally laid to rest. When she walked back to her car, she carried with her the painful comfort that, at least now, her daughter was where the world could see her, where her life was acknowledged, where her memory could be honored without shadows. Returning to the house was the hardest part. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside, knowing the building would never feel the same again. It had once been a home filled with ordinary joys, birthday parties, family dinners, school mornings, and quiet evenings. Then it had become a place of hidden tragedy, a mausoleum of lies. Now it was simply empty, a shell of a life that had come undone. She walked through the rooms deliberately, absorbing every detail, every piece of furniture, every framed photograph. She studied the kitchen where she once packed Sarah's lunches, The living room where she and Richard spent countless nights watching television. The hallway where Sarah used to run back and forth. Every room was layered with the echoes of lives that no longer existed. She knew then that she could not stay. The house had been her refuge for decades, but it had also become a reminder of everything broken her daughter's stolen life, her husband's silence, her own unknowing. She needed a space that was not built on buried truths, a place where she could breathe without the weight of the basement pressing up from below. She called a real estate agent the next day. It took less than a week for the agent to arrive. She was a brisk woman with a warm smile who spoke efficiently about market values and potential buyers. Anna nodded along mechanically, though most of the words washed over her. The agent walked through the house, taking notes, commenting on the charm of the architecture, the craftsmanship of the woodwork, the spacious yard. She praised the large basement, calling it a standout feature for any family who enjoys having a workshop or storage space. Anna flinched at that, though she didn't say why. When the agent left, promising to draw up paperwork, Anna stood in the center of the living room, listening to the quiet. The decision to leave felt both liberating and heartbreaking. The house had been her life for so long that leaving it felt like shedding a layer of her own skin. Yet she knew she couldn't move forward until she stepped out of its walls for good. Even the investigators had sensed the house's oppressive emotional weight. On their final visit, the lead officer handed her the last folder of documents and told her gently that the case was now closed. They had confirmed everything they could. The law could not punish a man who was no longer alive, and the years that had passed made any further action impossible. They offered her contacts for grief counseling, support groups, legal advice. She thanked them, but declined. She needed quiet, not conversation. After they left, she placed the folder on the dining table and returned once more to the hallway. The basement door loomed at the end, like a threshold she had been avoiding since the day she lifted the concrete slab. For a moment, she considered leaving it unopened, considered moving out of the house without ever setting foot in the basement again. But something deeper urged her forward. Not curiosity, not duty, but a quiet need to acknowledge the space where so much of her life had been unknowingly shaped. She opened the door. The stairs creaked beneath her as she descended, each step echoing in the stillness. The basement was brighter now. The investigators had replaced the single bulb with a stronger light. The area where the grave had been was now a smooth, empty patch of concrete, freshly poured after the removal of the remains. It looked unnaturally clean compared to the rest of the room. She stood before the patch, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, and let herself feel the weight of everything the basement represented. It was no longer a place of invention. It was no longer a place of tragedy. It was simply the last chapter of a life built on love and marred by a terrible mistake. She whispered a few words, not a prayer, not a plea, but something softer, something like recognition. Then she turned off the light and climbed back up the stairs, leaving the basement behind for the last time. Packing the house took days. She worked slowly, sorting through decades of accumulated memories, placing some items in boxes and leaving others behind. She donated most of the furniture, keeping only a few things: a quilt she'd made with Sarah when she was little, a picture frame that held her favorite family photo, a small ceramic bird Richard had given her for their anniversary long ago. She packed the notebooks carefully, not out of reverence for Richard's inventions, but because they were part of the truth she could not erase. On her final morning in the house, she stood at the front door, looking back one last time. The rooms were empty, stripped of the life they had once contained. The walls echoed faintly with her footsteps. Outside, the car waited with the last of her belongings loaded inside. She took a deep breath, filled with a strange combination of sadness and resolve. She stepped outside, locked the door, and placed the key in an envelope for the agent. The air was cool against her skin. Leaves rustled softly along the driveway. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world went on, indifferent and steady. Anna walked to her car and opened the door. Before getting in, she took one final look at the house, the place where she had loved, suffered, endured, and survived. Then she closed the door, started the engine, and drove toward the small senior community where she had decided to live. For the first time in 26 years, she felt something close to freedom. Not happiness, not peace, but the quiet, fragile beginning of a life in which the truth was no longer buried beneath her feet. She would carry her daughter's memory with her. She would carry the truth of her husband's actions with her, too. Not as a weight meant to destroy her, but as a testament to everything she had endured. And as she drove away, leaving the house receding in the rearview mirror, she understood that while the past could not be changed, the future, whatever it held, was finally hers to claim. Subscribe to the channel, watch the next videos, and share this one with others.